Magandang umaga to all my friends in the Philippines. It's good to virtually be presenting to all of you today. Um, when Amor asked me if I could quickly come up with a presentation on how technology is changing the face of money worldwide and in the Philippines, and also a little bit about how the Philippines is fitting in with Fintech, I was glad to prepare a brief presentation and to speak. I'm also impressed with all my colleagues on the panel, and they all have unique perspectives as well on how the Philippines has evolved. So that'll be useful when we go to the panel discussion. Slide, here we go. So when we look at the future of money, so to speak, we've seen lots of changes. And as Amor mentioned, a lot of this started out, people didn't realize, the Philippines has actually, from a policy perspective, done a lot of interesting things. Take-up has been another issue, but as we talked about, the first kind of electronic mobile money that existed in the world actually started in the Philippines, first with smart money and BDO, which launched back in 20 years ago. And then in 2004, Globe set up a G Exchange, and they became kind of the first mobile network operator that actually owned kind of a money transfer license, and the first start of e-money the way we've seen it actually in Africa. So Kenya tried to learn. We were involved. I was working quite a bit with those days, both with Gcash and smart money. Yes, it was interesting. It was a lot of work. And I think part of the challenges were the value propositions that were different in the Philippines. So when the Kenyans came, they tried to do the same things, and then they realized it wasn't going to work in their environment. And the tipping point was really money transfers. And then what really happened is they had a crisis. And that was the tipping point. The election violence during the elections, nobody could leave. Nobody could leave their homes. They were locked in. So the only way to send money to employees and everybody else became through M-Pesa. So today, M-Pesa, and you find that all across Eastern Africa and other parts of Africa. And many of those, I worked a lot. I had the honor of working with a lot of central banks around the world, and I know many of them came to the Philippines to learn. So the Philippines really inspired this whole movement on mobile money. In fact, I still remember going to China in 2008 and presented Gcash on stage, and the Chinese laughed. They told me, "You don't know Chinese. We don't understand those Filipinos. We would never trust a mobile phone ever to send money. We love the feel of money. We'll never use a mobile phone for payments." This was 2008, 2009 in Beijing. And I actually moved money at that time through Gcash. We had a live video feed, and they actually moved it from, just using SMS from the Philippines to Beijing, and I moved it back out again. I know the central bank was there at the time, and they got a little concerned. They shut that loophole right after that. But it was interesting that it kind of sparked that interest. So as I said, the Philippines was that initial mover. And of course, in China, when they first started, they had the same issues. And it was really the red envelope that they give Ang Pao, that they give at Chinese New Year. That was really the tipping point in China. So all these countries had kind of a tipping point. And I do remember going to Indonesia as well. We presented what was happening with mobile money in the Philippines, and Indonesia was just beginning to privatize the mobile network operator network. And many Filipinos were going to Indonesia to actually help the mobile network industry because the Philippines had so much experience. So the Philippines actually inspired a lot, and many struggled. It really wasn't until Gojek and Grab kind of, infused a ton of money, and hopefully Hassan could talk a little bit about that. That money, those incentives created a tipping point when people could, pay less in mobile money than in cash to buy goods and services, and those rebates were quite significant, much more than anything we'd seen in the Philippines. That's where Indonesia's kind of e-money took off. And then, of course, the Philippines was one of the first central banks to really look at cryptocurrency exchanges, after Japan and a few other bold countries, and they actually license the exchanges. Many other central banks, including China and Russia and others, were outlawing cryptocurrency, in particular Bitcoin, even though most of it was still occurring in China. So you began to see the Philippines really having this kind of bold, at least on the policy regulatory side. And we did see a lot of work, I think, with Bitcoin. What I've seen, most of it is just people hoping to make money off it. But in the Philippines, I think the model that really worked was using cryptocurrencies, in particular Bitcoin, to get around some of the remittance issues. And it was really used for supporting remittance channels to the Philippines. So they did kind of find a little bit of a value proposition. Day-to-day payments, I think most of it, and people buying it, still speculation there. But and then, of course, we had Libra come in. Facebook announced a stable coin. It scared all the central banks. I worked with a lot of central banks. And this really pushed them. Many of them had been talking about central bank digital currency. I'd actually worked with several of them that were working on this several years ago. But when Libra came in, it's really pushed. I know China moved very quickly into it. And now I understand Libra, Facebook's Libra, will be launching under the new name Diem next year, probably early next year. And they've changed their model a bit. So we'll have to see, will Facebook be able to develop a remittance, basically global remittances for free, something that Alibaba had tried for a long time to do by MoneyGram, and they were blocked. But I think that you're going to see, once you could see remittances being transferred around the world for virtually free, I think that will be a big driver for some of these big players. So the big tech companies, we've seen it with Gojek locally, and Grab that have really done things. And Alibaba has done a lot with Alipay, and WeChat, of course, with WeChat Pay, and then phone companies that had large numbers of people. So I think we're beginning to see a lot of companies that have been outside of the banking sector that have really been driving the future of money. I get into the next question that I was asked about. So apart from looking at the future of money, it was also asked, when we look at the rankings, you see usually in ASEAN, Singapore, Thailand, Malaysia, and Indonesia are ahead of the Philippines in terms of fintech. Why is that? What are the real challenges? And having worked with the Philippines, the early days on the national retail payment systems, and early e-money days, I started using e-money in the Philippines in 2004. As I said, the Philippines was one of the first, but we never really saw the uptake until pretty much this year, where COVID really maybe has started that tipping point. And of course, the Philippines had done some useful things in terms of infrastructure. I think the key is really infrastructure. Information communication technologies, the Philippines has struggled for a long time, and I have a lot of respect for everybody at Globe and Smart, but it's two mobile network operators, and they've just, for whatever reason, lots of challenges, they've just never been able to get that continuity that really, again, Filipinos use a lot of video, but getting that bandwidth that's needed, particularly out in the rural areas, and bringing down the costs of internet access, like we've seen in some of the other markets. Indonesia's actually done quite well there. The other one is digital IDs. Many of these other markets, they've had forms of identification which makes know your customer rules and ability to check on who's paying and everything is so much easier. The Philippines, for 20 years, they were fighting a national ID system, again, historical issues and concerns, trust in the government. And it wasn't until the current president that really pushed through, for the first time ever, a digital ID. And it's taken some time. It's coming. And we see, if you look at digital IDs, if you look at India and China in particular, that having that digital ID is a real driver. And we're seeing it also in Singapore and Thailand, Malaysia. Once you've got that digital ID in place, it makes a huge difference. So that next piece of infrastructure is identification infrastructure. Payments, now the Philippines was behind many of these other countries. I mean, Thailand, Malaysia, Singapore, and Indonesia all had bank-to-bank transfers that were, much cheaper than writing checks. In fact, the central bank, I remember in Malaysia, actually charges a penalty when you write a check as opposed to doing an electronic funds transfer. I remember discussing that with a former governor. He said there's no way we could charge the banks. Anyway, that payment infrastructure, the national retail payment systems, the PesoNet, that's beginning to take place. But the Philippines, again, was behind many of these other markets in terms of developing that payment infrastructure, those payment rails is coming. And then lastly, where the digital ID kind of gets you into an account and payments are the rail to move money around, the real thing to get uptake is data sharing and the ability to make use of data, share that data, access that data. The Philippines, one thing that you've got is a data privacy commission, which many, like Indonesia, does not have. And I've been doing a lot of work with Indonesia. They've actually been looking to learn from the Philippines because the rules around data sharing, as we've seen in the Philippines, some of the abuses, but what's been good is that they've been reported and acted upon. And I think having those rules in place and then opening that up, and as this morning I just got from the central bank, they posted now they're leapfrogging over, again, they're going to be another, first in the world, pretty much. The UK started with a lot of the work in Europe on open banking, but the Philippines has taken that to the next level, and they've just announced the circuiting. And later today will be the industry sandbox will be launched, which I'm excited about. And that is really going to help, I think, to be open up the whole use of open APIs and us to that. And it's great to see the two industry associations both coming together, working on this and coordinating with the central bank. So we're very excited about that. So again, just to wrap up, the challenges and opportunities are basically, whatever can be done to support digital identification. It is happening. It's slow. There will be some problems with it. There'll be some breaches and other things. And I think it's how you respond and how you deal with that. You can see the issues that India has had, how they've managed it. And if we can get the Philippines, it'll take time, but once it's in place, it'll make a big difference. The payments and data sharing infrastructure, I think Amor talked about attracting talent. You're doing a great job. I mean, you've got people, look at Hassan, he came over, he's got lots of experience from around the world. You've got a lot of talented people who've come in and a lot of talented Filipinos. I mean, Dick, I remember, he's one of the early pioneers there in the payments infrastructure. So you really have some very smart, well-educated people. I mean, I made the Philippines my home for 15 years. So I actually see it's a wonderful place to live. And I think you can attract the talent you need. I think you need to work on education to be able to make sure that a lot of the talent is Filipino talent as well. You don't need as much foreign talent. A little bit you do, but again, all markets do. But I think if you work on education, you can bring that up. Investments, that's the other thing. The Philippines has some investments. I think they could do better. You see Singapore, Indonesia really coming in with very large investments into the fintech sector. And lastly, it's digital financial literacy. I mean, you've got 7,000 islands. And we talk about, financial literacy, but then I'm talking about, digital financial literacy. It can't be just through schools. I think there are opportunities to bring that in, but I really see opportunities of using chatbots and other things that run on applications that people have like Facebook or Viber to be able to provide those kind of useful tools in education. And some of that's happening. I know that BSP has already a chatbot for complaint management, but I think if you take that to the next level, I have found those kind of financial health tools to be very useful. So on that note, Maraming Salamat. I'll turn it over to John. Thank you.